Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 16th of June of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with Pyatikhatki, with Kamyansky Bridgehead. This is the area that's located on the west of Orikhiv, right along the bank of Dnipro, ex-Dnipro water reservoir and so on. The Ukrainians during the day made few attempts to penetrate the Russians' defense belt. They were trying to attack the Russians and the Russian positions in the vicinity of small settlement by the name of Pyatikhatki. This is the settlement. The Russians are saying that for those purposes the Ukrainians were using the forces of 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, so let's move them closer to the combat line, and that was the main forces from the Ukrainian side. If you remember, we discussed that during the previous few days the Ukrainians have redeployed their 130th Reconnaissance Battalion, and during the previous week the Ukrainians made a lot of recon and combat operations in this area, and probably today that wasn't a real Ukrainian attack, but that was a logical continue of recos in combat. That was reco in force in direction of Pyatikhatki. And the thing is that most of the Russian sources maps have been updated. Currently they show completely different configuration of the front line in the vicinity of Lapkova, so we will update this map as well. So basically before the beginning of that storming operation the Ukrainians had control over this territory. So that was the progress of the Ukrainians as a result of fierce fightings during the previous days in this area. So we have added this small flag showing the Ukrainian progress. And today the Ukrainians launched their attack, but you need to understand one important thing about this territory, and and I'm talking about the river. So there is a small river, Yancherkrak. This you see this blue title, and this river goes exactly on the northern edge of this settlement, this one. And as you can see, the Ukrainians didn't have enough of a very big bridgehead or enough of squares to attack in direction of Pyatikhatki, and the Russian source reported that the Ukrainians as a result of attack managed to enter the western side of Pyatikhatki. So basically that means that Ukrainians during the day, after a few days of recon combos, started recon force, and they were moving exactly along these arrows. So they bypassed the recently captured territories, then they entered the forest, and also they were moving between the forest and the river, and they entered the western part of Pyatikhatki. The Russians are saying that during the day they were redeployed their reinforcements and their reserves closer to the combat line. The Russians were saying that they sent the force of 429th Motorized Rifle Regiment, and also the Russians sent reserves of 291st Motorized Regiment as well. Probably some of those units were already located there, and some of them were sent, some of them were there. So anyway, basically today from the Ukrainian side we saw the forces of 128th Mountain Assault Brigade and the forces of 130th Reconnaissance Battalion, and from the Russian side there were forces of 429th Motorized Rifle Regiment and the forces of 291st Motorized Regiment as well. And there was a very fierce fightings, very fierce clashes in this area, and somewhere at noontime the Russians reported that as a result of fierce fighting, the first result was that Ukrainians at 1 p.m. of the local time have already lost 2 tanks, 3 infantry armored personal carriers, and 1 platoon. And when talking about the number of Ukrainian forces that were involved in that attack, the Russians are saying that around 15 armored vehicles started movements in direction of Pyatikhatki. And basically by the, let's say, 9 p.m. of the local time, the Russians reported that as a result of artillery attacks, as a result of counter-offensive operation of reserves that were redeployed in this area, the Ukrainians were forced to step back, and basically they left the western outskirts of Petykhatki. Furthermore, the Russians published the video how they were sending like helicopters, and that helicopters were attacking the Ukrainian positions. The helicopters were flying on the very low distance from the ground, from the surface, and they were attacking with unguided bombs and probably with guided missiles the Ukrainians' armored vehicles. And as a result of those clashes, very fierce clashes, the Ukrainians were forced to step back. But now the most important part has started. The thing is that, as you can see one more time, the Ukrainians, if they did really enter the western part of Petykhatki, was able to attack just from the north, from Lapkova to the south, along the river and along or through the forest. And basically, if the Russians reported that they forced the Ukrainians to leave the western part of Petykhatki, that means that the Ukrainians during the day managed to establish 100% control over this forest that located on the west of Petykhatki. So basically, this is the current front line in this small tactical bridgehead. And this is a very big problem for the Russians because they haven't reported us and gave us any updates that they managed to push the Ukrainians back from this bridgehead. And basically, if this configuration is correct and according to the information facts we received from this front line, currently the Ukrainians control this forest. Now the Ukrainians have already established at least something like physical or fire control over the road that connects small settlements Zhiribyanki and Petykhatki. So these two settlements are currently cut off and split in two parts. Of course, this will increase the logistic expenses for the Russians. Currently, they need to find a solution how to push the Ukrainians from this forest as well. And this bridgehead gives the Ukrainians currently to make a decision where to attack next. Now the Ukrainians can advance in direction of Zhiribets, and the Ukrainians can restart offensive operation in Petykhatki and to complete the clearing of this settlement as well. Very difficult situation for the Russians. We'll see what they're going to do tomorrow, because tomorrow, I believe, after some regrouping, the Ukrainians will continue. Furthermore, the Russians published very interesting video from the north how they managed to destroy the Ukrainians' radar system that located in the vicinity of Zaporozhye. As you can see, this radar is located very far from the combat line, and the Russians, using the artillery shell, as you can see, this white dot destroyed the radar that located very far from the combat line. And this was fantastic, to tell the truth. This type of weapon, we can try to calculate the distance between Russian positions, at least between the Russian front line and that settlement, and the distance is around 30 kilometers. I believe that the Russians weren't attack the Ukrainians right from the combat line, let's say from the southern part, from Kamyansky. Probably the Russians were attacking this small settlement a little bit like somewhere from Vasilyevka, and the distance from Vasilyevka is around 40 kilometers. So fantastic weapon. So we'll see whether the Russians are planning to use this weapon more and give us more updates about their attempts to attack the Russian back positions and so on. Now we are moving to Orikhiv. We haven't received any big updates from this settlement, neither any ammo depots of 65th or 47th mechanized brigades were destroyed. The only interesting update is that, according to the Russian sources, the Ukrainians were planning to launch their counter-offensive operation, to be precise, relaunch their counter-offensive operation in this area the previous night. They were planning to attack in direction of Rabotina, and for those purposes the Ukrainians were planning to use the forces of 47th Brigade, but because of very heavy losses among the soldiers of that brigade, the soldiers and some officers of that brigade took a decision not to follow the Ukrainian orders. Currently, the Ukrainian authorities make some kind of investigation. They currently captured the soldiers and officers who made the strike, and I believe that in a day, in a two, the Ukrainians will restart their attempts and they will continue attacking in direction of Rabotina. But currently, we see that when talking about this front line, the Ukrainians managed to develop their bridgehead just in the vicinity of Kamyanskaya. Now we are moving to Vremivka, Gulyai Pole, and Vremivka tactical bridgehead. The Ukrainians continue sending their commandos and squads in direction like commandos and scouts in direction of Dorozhnyanka, in direction of small settlement Konstantinovka, in direction of small settlement like Novoselovka. And today the Russians reported that as a result of another Recco in combat operation from the Ukrainian side, they managed to discover and to destroy the Ukrainian commandos in the south of Gulyai-Polye in the vicinity of Dorozhnyanka. Now we are moving to the Vremivka tactical bridgehead. Today we received a lot of updates from this territory. The Ukrainians were attacking, made at least 3 attempts to attack the Russian forces in direction of Robnovpol from Novodarivka through the fields that were already demined by the Ukrainians' armored vehicles. They were attacking the Russian positions from the north, trying to cut the salient, and of course the Ukrainians were trying to attack the Russians from the northeast, but all those attempts were repelled by the Russians and the Ukrainians were forced to step back, having very big losses on this bridgehead. And that's it about the western, let's say front, western part of Vremivka tactical bridgehead. And now we're moving to the eastern front. The Russians are saying that they also managed to repel the Ukrainians' attack in the vicinity of Blagodatna in direction of Makarovka and Urozhaina, and the Russians managed to repel the another Ukrainian attack among these fields between Makarovka, Urozhaina, Novodonetsk, Kremenchuk and Staromlynovka. And currently this is the most interesting part of this front line. I'm talking about the fields between Urozhaina, Staromlynovka, Novodonetsk and Kremenchuk. These fields is covered with the fog of war because, for example, one Russian sources have published a video how there were the video of clashes and fierce fightings on the northern edge of these fields. As you can see, the flag shows that the Russians defense belt that they controls this territory. The Russians published the video how the Ukrainians were moving along the forest lines and how the Russians were bombing and shelling the Ukrainians with all types of weapons they have. Some Ukrainian weapon was destroyed, some Ukrainian tanks were destroyed among these forest lines. Some of them managed to bypass and probably moved to some direction. Anyway, the Russians are saying that by this video from some source on the ground from this territory, the Russians are trying to say that they controls the, let's say, the eastern wall of Makarovka, so this small salient. But another Russian blogger, Rybar, I believe you know this source and you are familiar with this map, says that the Ukrainians, as a result of clashes during the previous days, managed to penetrate the Russians' defense belt in this territory and move as close as possible to the settlement by the name of Staromlynovka. I will update this map for you just to show you the proximate bridgehead according to Rybar. And according to this blogger, the Ukrainians controls this territory on this bridgehead. Of course, we understand that these are two completely different stories. One story tell us, the first one that we discussed, that the settlements like Makarovka, Blagodatna and Storozhova that located on the lowland currently are encircled, and this is a small cauldron, and the Russians, with the first version that we discussed, did establish control, physical and fact control over the supply roads on this territory like this one, and from the eastern flank and from the western flank the Russians control the hills, and they had control physical, or at least we saw a lot of video how the Russians were using drones flying above this territory. So this is the first story where the Ukrainians appeared in the cauldron. But according to the second story, according to the Rybar, the Ukrainians, as a result of fierce fightings during the previous days, managed to penetrate the Russians' defense orders and to get as close as possible to the supply road between Staromlynovka and Kremenchuk. And this is completely different situation, because based on this map we see that the Ukrainians managed to establish at least physical control over the roads between Kremenchuk and Novodonetsk, and we need to expect for more active intensifying of clashes from the Ukrainian side from the north in direction of Novodonetsk using the forces of 37th Brigade and 1st Tank Brigade. And of course, if the Ukrainians manage to develop this bridgehead, they manage to cut the supply road that goes to Urozhaino, at least from Staromlynovka. So two completely different stories. It's very difficult to understand what exactly is happening there, but the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, for example, reported that as a result of fierce fightings, particularly just on the Vremivka tactical bridgehead, the Ukrainians lost 200 soldiers, 21 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems. So we'll see anyway in a day, in a 2, or in a 3, the fog of war will disappear, and we will understand the real picture on this front line. If you ask me, I would say that I believe in the first option, that the Russians have control over this salient, and that they have established at least operational encirclement of Ukrainian forces in Makarovka, Storozhov, and Blagodatne. Maybe the Ukrainians managed to penetrate the Russians' defense belt between, let's say, somewhere just in small part of these fields on the west from Novodonetsk, but it's just my assumptions and just my speculation. We need to wait, and then we are going to see more updates and more reliable piece of information. Now we're moving further to the South Donetsk area, to Marinko Bridgehead. If you remember, yesterday we discussed that the Russians, as a result of a small offensive operation to the south, managed to capture some trenches on the north of Novomikhailivka. Today, the Ukrainians made another attempt to return their lost positions, but that attack was repelled by the Russians, and the Ukrainians were forced to step back. And I'll remind you that currently the Ukrainians were forced to redeploy the forces of 35th Mechanized Brigade that recently was located between Krasnogorovka and Marinka. And furthermore, the Russians reported that the 79th Air Assault Brigade had very big losses during the previous weeks and months. Were forced to redeploy to the south, to the mainland of Ukraine, and the Ukrainians were forced to replace these forces with 95th Brigade. But for now, we still haven't received any confirmation from any mapper who follow the deployment situation. So let's wait a little bit with this update, because this also update we received from Rybar. But anyway, the fact is that Ukrainians were forced to redeploy the 35th Brigade, and as we see, the Ukrainians have reduced their power on this bridgehead, and that's the reason. This is the main reason why the Russians are trying to develop their attacks in the vicinity of Pobeda, on the fields between Novomikhailivka and Pobeda. Also, the Russians reported that they repelled another Ukrainian attack from Krasnogorovka in direction of Staromikhailivka. Also, the Russians repelled another attempt of the Ukrainians to return lost positions between Nivelska, Pervomayska, and Pesky, somewhere in this area. From the Russian side, they published the video how they were bombing and shelling the Ukrainian trenches and fortifications behind Pervomayska. And basically, the Russians published the video of Ukrainians leaving road between Pervomayska and Nivolska, because this road the Ukrainians use for supplying and supporting their forces in Nivolska, and this is very tough nut for the Russians. They need to establish control over these settlements, but for now they can't do this. And the main reason of that is that Ukrainians still have stable connection, stable supply road that goes along this road from Pervomayska to Nivolska. So the Russians were trying to bomb, and probably we need to expect some kind of activation from the Russian side and more attempts to attack in direction of Nivolska. This territory is under protection of 59th Motorized Brigade, and probably this brigade is located here for the last few months, and they are pretty not fresh, but they're not they are not bleeded when talking about the manpower and so on. We haven't got a lot of updates from the Ministry of Defense that they were attacking or shelling or bombing this brigade. From the other side, we know that Ukrainians use this bridgehead to attack and bomb Donetsk with artillery, with different types of artillery systems. We haven't received any updates about Avdiivka bridgehead for the previous 24 hours. Maybe there was clashes of the local value, just a stable front line, just artillery duels, nothing more. We got another geo confirmation of Russian positions in the vicinity of New York, the Ukrainian New York, and based on this map we see that the Russians managed to develop a little bit their bridgehead on the northern part of this settlement, and basically the Russians controls something like this, the entire Novoselovska and the fortifications and the trenches on the east from the northern edge of this settlement. Now we are moving further. The Russians reported they destroyed the ammo depot of 109th Brigade in the vicinity of New York. And now we're getting to Artyomovsk. There we got a lot of very interesting updates. For example, the Russian sources map have been updated, and currently we see that there is, we can say that the first notes of critical situation in the vicinity of Klishchiivka has appeared. The Ukrainians made another attempt, another offensive, counter-offensive operation in direction of Klishchiivka from the north, probably using the forces of 5th Assault Brigade, and they were attacking in this direction. The Russians managed to repel that attack, but basically we can say that this bridgehead that Ukrainians were attacking is the main Russian fortification area. So there are the main Russian fortifications exactly located in these fields between, let's say, this road and the icon of 5th Assault Brigade and Klishchiivka itself. And if the Ukrainians are able to capture these fortifications, we can start counting days before Klishchiivka falls. Furthermore, there is another fortification area to the south. This area like secures Klishchiivka from the southwest. But anyway, the Russians are saying that basically they have lost control. Not the control, maybe this is the wrong word. Let's add first of all like a cloud, and then we will discuss. Basically, according to the information we have, the Russians are no longer able to use these fields. And for example, if they want to supply and support their forces along the channel on this like side of like Klishchiivka bridgehead, they need to use, and they can use, just the roads along the forest lines. I'm not saying that Ukrainians managed to enter this bridgehead, but this territory is basically under Russian control. There are no Ukrainians, but the Russians can't use these fields to supply and support their forces on the western and part of this bridgehead and along the channel. They need to like somehow to make a small a lot of roads to bypass before they get the positions they need. Furthermore, the Russians published another video how they were bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions in front of, let's remind, the Domino fortification. The Russians were bombing and shelling the Ukrainian trenches, and as you can see, there are still a lot of Ukrainians. They dig in very deep and in the ground on these territories. One building was destroyed as a result of attack, and that was the checkpoint of the Ukrainian forces. We see that the Russians are trying, by using artillery attacks, by using some like pods and so on, try to reduce the first defense line and just to force the Ukrainians to step back from this territory, because the Ukrainians using these positions, because these positions are located on the hill in comparison with Artyomovsk, can control and coordinate the Ukrainian artillery when the Ukrainians attack Domino fortifications and the vicinity and the MiG-17 square. There were no updates about any attempts from the Ukrainian side to attack the northern flank of Artyomovsk, and now we're moving to Siversk and Sporne bridgehead. The Russians published another geo-confirmation of their position, showing that during the previous week there were clashes on the south of Sporne, and basically the Russians controls a little bit bigger bridgehead, and the Russians controls, let's say something like this on this bridgehead. And as you can see, they managed to bypass Sporne from the south. The Russians haven't entered Sporne itself, at least the western part, but at least they control the fortifications on the south of this settlement. And there is just like one defense line that between the Russians and the final capture of Sporne, and I'm talking about these forest lines, and this is the main Ukrainian positions, and right in front of them we can find the Russians' positions. When talking about the entire Donetsk front line, the Russians reported that Ukrainians lost 215 soldiers, 8 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems on the front line, starting from Mariinka to Siversk. When talking about Bilogorovka, the Russians mappers have updated their maps, showing that probably, I'm not sure about that, but the Russians are saying that probably the Ukrainians controls establish control or control this part of the south and the south of Bilogorovka, or this territory is in the gray zone, or this territory is under Ukrainians. Furthermore, we got another very interesting video from Kremenная Forest. Today the Russians published how they're bombing and shelling this road. This, as you can see, this road. This is the road that you can see on the video, this one. And basically on this video you see how the Russians were attacking the Ukrainians along this like forest line. So that means that the territory on the right from this white line belongs or under Ukrainian control. Not the entire one, but at least this part is under Ukrainian control. Now we are moving further to the south. The Ukrainians, as we discussed recently, have redeployed their forces of 63rd Mechanized Brigade in the vicinity of Tarskoye, Zarechne, and as soon as the Ukrainians got fresh forces on this front line, they started attacking the Russians on this small salient in front of Tarskoye. That attack was repelled by the Russians, but anyway, we see as soon as the Ukrainians redeployed fresh forces, we see a real activation of clashes on this front line. And now we're moving to Novoselovskaya. Today the Russians and the Ukrainians confirmed, provide us more geolocated information, and basically according to those piece of information we have, the Ukrainians did have control over Novoselovskaya on the Russian side of the railroadways. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings on the Kupiansk and Liman front line, the Ukrainians lost 110 soldiers, 9 armored vehicles and 3 artillery systems. The Russians reported that as a result of bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions in the vicinity of Liman Первый Dvorichne, they managed to break the rotation process of the Ukrainians on this front line. But as usually, no movements and no changes on the ground during the previous few days. Very interesting updates are coming from Prigozhin, from head of Wagner's. Recently, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation have adopted another law and another regulation, and according to new regulation, every single private military, every single PMC and volunteer forces should sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense, and Prigozhin and Wagner's refused to sign that contract. This is another media game by Prigozhin, and now the Prigozhin and the Wagner's PMC provided their own version of the contract to the Ministry of Defense. So that means that anyway they will sign a contract, and as was promised, the Wagners will be redeployed by the 5th of August. And as I understand, the main thing that they're trying to regulate is the level of supply support of Wagner's. Of course, Wagner's is not a regular forces. Wagner's is not a regular PMC. Wagner's is a very big military corps with its structure, own history, and own experience. And of course, they need more, and they pay more with their own lives during this or that operation. So basically, currently they're trying to solve the issues between themselves, between the Wagner's and between the Ministry of Defense. Today, the President of Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, gave his own speech, and he was talking about the special military operation, and he reported that since the beginning of Ukrainian counter-offensive operation that took place on the 4th of June, the Ukrainians have already lost 186 tanks on the South Zaporozhye area and around 418 fighting infantry machines. So as you can see, the losses are very heavy. Also, he added that if Ukrainians continue bombing and shelling the settlements along the border on the territory of Russian Federation, then the Russians will obviously make a decision to create a buffer zone, but on the territory of Ukraine, and to push the Ukrainian positions as far as possible from border. So basically, Putin started the beginning of another operation, and of course, basically we're talking about operation something like this, when the Russians will attack the Ukrainians in direction of Chernigiv, in direction of Sumy, and in direction of Kharkiv area, with one purpose: to create something like this on these territories, and maybe even to capture Kharkiv. We'll see whether the Russians are able to do this or not. And that's it for today. Military Summer channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.